Hello, and thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Anugraha Palan, and I'm joined here at the Zone by Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General for the United Nations. Thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted and honored you could be here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a great moment.
So, Amina, this spring meetings are really happening at a time of crisis, and this has been a thread running through the whole spring meetings in terms of the conversation here. In terms of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that you have been such a big part of framing and driving forward, where do you think the world is with regard to the SDGs right now?
Well, sadly, we're not in a very good place where the SDGs are concerned. 7 years later, we're not meeting any of the targets. We will have the stock take this year. It will look to see how far we've gone, where the gaps are, and what we need to do in the next 7 years to get to the promises of the SDGs. For the world, the crisis, of course, has compounded many of the efforts that were made. We've reversed many of the progress we've had on gender, on human rights, on jobs, and all this has been exacerbated by COVID. And now, of course, the war in Ukraine, the impacts of that in developing countries. Nevertheless, crisis is one thing. Having the solutions to address it and the framing of the SDGs is still as relevant today as it was in 2015. It's what brings people around the table. They find their place in the responses that they need to the socioeconomic crisis. And that's, I think, the plus for us. It's to get people again around the table. Now, the challenge is that we have to go from the billions to the trillions. And that's where the discussions in Washington, the discussions at the spring meetings are really important to finding that way and that pathway to fuel what we have to do to get back on track.
And to pick up on that point, the UN has come up with the SDG stimulus, the point about the SDG stimulus and needing that SDG stimulus. This March, just maybe a month ago.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What's the vision for it?
Yeah. Well, this is the SDGs offer to the G20 because what we're looking at is to say, where are the means of implementation? Where are the barriers to us getting the resources that we need for developing countries, particularly when many have seen the response in COVID in the north of our world in developed countries happened. It didn't happen in the south. With the impacts of Ukraine, it's the same thing. So we are looking for a way to balance this, and the SDG stimulus does that by addressing debt and the restructuring that is needed for many countries now who are facing a debt crisis through no fault of their own. And there are over 60 of them, as I say, on debt row. It will also look at liquidity. How can we make accessible finance to these countries at affordable and longer-term conditions? And third, the reforms. What needs to happen with what we have now, the IFIs, the MDBs? And in the longer term, you'll see from our common agenda that the international financial architecture that we feel needs to be completely revamped will be a second step for it. But in the stimulus, let's see what we can do with the debt restructuring. Let's see how we can open up more in terms of liquidity. It includes looking at the banks, leveraging your own muscle to get more money from the private sector, more lending. There are many initiatives that have been put on the table as a result of that. And in particular here, maybe mention the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, who are looking at the SDRs that could be rechanneled. Good news today when we hear Japan talk about 40% of their SDRs are coming to development. So really important that the SDG stimulus is not facing any one crisis or the other. It's saying to you that overall sustainable development's in trouble. We're not meeting the goals, and these are some of the things that we can do more immediately.
So just picking up on that point about the role the World Bank can play,
Yes.
especially this week. The UN and the World Bank have been partnering at the country level and at the global level on accomplishing and attaining the SDG goals. Where do you think this partnership is working well, and what more do you think we could be doing together?
We're very fortunate that the partnership between the bank and the UN has been very solid. And we've been able to work in many places, in Yemen, more recently in Pakistan, when we had to have a response very quick to a huge climate catastrophe, and seeing how that turned around really quickly. So our relationships, both in coming together globally to find the response, that's needed, and then even better to on the ground have a division of labor that we are addressing the climate crisis, we are addressing conflicts in humanitarian settings. What we would like to see going forward is how do we do this with a much deeper integrated response to development. It is beyond the two goals. The two goals for the bank are poverty and prosperity. We're missing the environment and climate piece. And so let's bring them all together. Sustainable development is about social, it is about the economy, it's about the environment. So bringing that DNA together into our work, I think the opportunities now are when the bank comes to look at the evolution roadmap. How do we frame that? What is the ambition of it? What are the roles and responsibilities? How as a international community and family, do we come to give the best support possible for countries in a more coordinated and coherent manner?
Thank you so much, Amina.
Welcome.
That was Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.